Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the American Political Science Association. My name is Kimberly Mealy. I'm the Senior Director of Diversity and Inclusion here at the Association. Today, we are delighted to present the book launch of Stay Woke, A People's Guide to Making All Black Lives Matter. We are joined this afternoon by the authors, Dr. Tehama Lopez Bunyasi and Dr. Candis Watts-Smith. Dr. Lopez Bunyasi is Assistant Professor of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. Her scholarship lays at the intersection of race and politics in the United States with specializations in racial attitudes and ideologies, structural inequality, racial marginalization, and the politics of whiteness. Her scholarship has been supported by the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Samuel Du Bois Cook Postdoctoral Fellowship at Duke University. She is also an alum of the APSA Ralph Bunche Summer Institute program. Dr. Candis Watts-Smith is Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Penn State University. Her research focuses on identity, political behavior, and social policy and inequality. In addition to Stay Woke, she is also the co-author of Racial Stasis, the Millennial Generation and the Stagnation of Racial Attitudes in American Politics, as well as Black Mosaic, the Politics of Black Pan-Ethnic Diversity. She is also an alum of the APSA Ralph Bunche Summer Institute, as well as the APSA Minority Fellowship Program. This event is being live streamed by the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason University. We will take your questions following the talk. If you would rather ask your question off camera, we will also be able to accommodate that after the program. Thank you. And without further ado, we will hand it over to the co-authors.
Good afternoon. So it is such a pleasure to be here and an honor to be with you all, our friends, our family, our future friends that we're gonna meet today. So Tehama and I talk. We spend a lot of time together, mostly on the phone, but together. And we talk about our families and our work because we're friends, but then we also talk about our experiences in our classrooms. We talk a lot about what we see on the news and social media. And we talk a lot about the patterns of questions that show up. Why is there a Black Lives Matter movement when there has also been a Black president? Am I a racist? What does it mean to be colorblind? Or, it's questions like that. What are microaggressions? And so what we hope to do is to answer these questions for different reasons. We notice that some people ask these questions out of sheer curiosity, that they are really motivated to do better, that they know that there are inequalities in this world, in this society, and they are interested in improving outcomes, using their talents, their skills, their knowledge, their resources to ameliorate some of the disparities that we see. There are also people who ask these questions who actually have no intent on trying to understand the answers. And so we wrote Stay Woke for both of these groups, for people who want to be inspired, motivated, to learn more. We wanted to provide inspiration, motivation, and information. But then also to the other group, I would say that we were motivated to make claims of ignorance less legitimate. That by providing information that they can't say that they didn't know. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. The second thing, before I hand it off to Tehama, is to point out that we are political scientists. We are trained political scientists, and the goals of political science are to march toward truth around a number of important questions. So questions like, why do people vote the way they do? Why do people make certain decisions in the political realm that they do? How and why do we see inequalities created, embedded, exacerbated, or ameliorated in a democracy? Does it matter if our political representatives mimic the demographic characteristics of the population? So we answer questions like this. And in doing that, we have also been trained to report what we learn in a certain kind of way. We have to use certain language, we have to use a certain structure, a certain format, we have to cite certain people, we have to put this information in certain places. So we are incentivized to publish in this very constrained way in a very particular set of places, often places that many people don't have access to. So stay woke is unconventional in that way, that we don't necessarily conform to the language, the words. We do the citations.
We do the citations, yep.
Or the place, right? Our goal was to create something that our neighbors, our families, our friends, our students could have access to. So when the American Political Science Association agreed and welcomed us to launch our book here, it is also a signal to say that political scientists could and should and are encouraged to present their work and introduce their knowledge to a wider array of individuals, right? The things that we know and learn have ramifications for our everyday lives. So for that, we have to thank Kim Neely and the American Political Science Association for having us. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. We also want to just take a moment to thank everybody who's here in this room. We wanted to thank especially our husbands, my husband Sakwa, who has been really supportive. It's a very difficult thing to undertake a book, and it's a lot of time that we take. And so my husband Sakwa, Candis's husband Terrell, our families, our kids, who we do our best to be present with them, and at the same time, there's maybe a way in which they know that, like, okay, hold on, I can't answer that question right now because I'm on the phone with my co-author. So we want to thank them for their support and their encouragement. My mother has been absolutely fabulous too. She's been a major support system for us, our extended families, Candis's parents, and we want to thank our neighbors. We want to thank our colleagues for the support along the way too, because we really believe, right, it takes a village not just to raise a child, but to do almost anything. It takes a village. So that's the orientation here of this book. And so I think I'll just get started here. I'm going to do my best with this. This is a very sensitive clicker, apparently. Okay, so we want to talk about, it goes the other way. Or does it? Let's see. There we go. How about we do this? There we go. Okay. To give you some sense of the motivation behind how we structured the book, we wanted the book to read fully as a book, right? At the same time, we wanted for any instructor to be able to just pull a chapter out and use it on its own, standalone, right? And so that's how this book is structured. But we start out making the case for those who need the case to be made, especially, that there is a real precarity to Black life in the United States, as in other parts of the world, right? And that is a result of institutional, structural, and interpersonal racism. We spend chapter 1 on the matter of Black lives, laying out a constellation of ways in which Black life is undervalued and is threatened, right? In which racial disparities exist, not just within criminal justice reform and in policing, which is what we think has really been grabbed the most attention with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And so we wanted to address that. Let's see how this goes here. Oops, goes the other way. So as we're watching the Black Lives Matter movement unfold, we're also noticing that people are hearing this message in a lot of different ways, right? There are some people who get it immediately, who understand that, that the call for Black Lives Matter is both insisting on the inherent value of human life, and at the same time is also aspirational, that there's a way in which Black lives are not being fully valued. There are other people who are hearing this message and they're thinking, well, what do you mean? Do some other lives not matter? Do white lives not matter? What about Native American lives, right? What about police lives? What about this and that, right? So you start hearing all these alternate calls. All lives matter. Blue lives matter, right? And so we spend part of this first chapter laying out, well, why does this message even sound different? If we look at the kind of ways in which we set up our lives, right, we live in different worlds, right? And we want to make this really clear. We're living in different worlds. Most Black people are surrounding themselves and are surrounded by a lot of Black people, and white Americans are even much more, racially, in a way, isolated and alienated from other people, right? So let's just start out there. The message is getting lost, probably because we don't know each other, right? And a lot of us don't even trust each other. I gotta get used to this clicker. Okay. We also move on to talk about some uncomfortable truths. And so we talk about criminal justice reform, we talk about policing, we talk about the ways in which Black people going about their daily lives, doing nothing in particular, are under threat, right? And so this is not very different, unfortunately, than a century ago when Black lives were being threatened by mobs, mostly white mobs, right? And sometimes with police involved or police looking the other direction, right? So that it was condoned, both just in the public sphere and also by the legal system. But that this calendar that we've created comes from actual statistics, right? Actual trends. So we want to lay that out. I keep doing this, okay. But we want to go beyond the realm of policing. We want to talk also about how racial disparities exist in other spheres, like education. Most people think that segregation in public schools is mostly in the South. But if we look at the top 20 most segregated states for Black students, right, in the 21st century, it's all over the place, right? This has to do with the way that we have structured our neighborhoods, right? The way we have incentivized certain neighborhoods to be mostly white, the way that certain home values, right, the creating of housing markets, right? These have a historical, policy-oriented origin, right? And this is still our reality. I got it right this time. Okay. Another thing that we've seen, this is a graph showing unemployment by race, and the top line is Black unemployment, the middle one is white unemployment, and here's the Black to white ratio from 1972 to 2018. We've heard a lot, especially in the Trump administration, that Black employment is better than it's ever been. Okay, well, you, I guess, could make some of that claim. At the same time, it's the gap that still exists, right? So to be congratulatory about low unemployment rates is one thing, but to talk about the fact that this is still a different reality than what white people are experiencing, that is not to be congratulated, but it also needs to be stated, right, that this is a reality. So this is one thing we're also trying to bring up. So after we've set the stage for why a Black Lives Matter movement needed to exist, right? Why this is necessary, especially in the second term of the first Black president of the United States, we spend chapter 2 talking about why we speak past each other, right? That we're probably not even using the same language when we use certain words. How are we going to have a productive conversation about race and racism if we don't even know about the words that we're talking about, and even concepts, right? So we break up this kind of category of words. We have foundational concepts for how you need to understand the movement. We have categories called tools of liberation and tools of oppression. We have a category called the wisdom of popular culture, right? And so to give you a sense of what this kind of, this chapter looks like, we'll take a concept like culture of poverty. And it's a little bit easier, I think, if I read from the book instead, right? So when you get onto this page, you're gonna get a basic set of definitions, and sometimes these are contradictory definitions, right? And sometimes we have a quote at the start, but let me just read how this looks. The ideological stance called culture of poverty is rooted in the idea that poor people are poor because they don't know how to work toward the American dream. Though this idea has been used to explain poverty generally speaking, it is most often used to explain persistent racial disparities. One of the best-known historical references to such an idea comes from the now very famous or infamous Moynihan Report, which essentially argued that while white supremacy was a barrier for black people, black culture, marked by female-headed households, was the greatest barrier preventing black folks from living up to their full potential. Since then, others have mimicked this notion, combining structural factors with cultural ones to explain why blacks fall behind whites on important socioeconomic indicators. Racial differences in employment and earnings, educational attainment, and family structure cannot be explained by culture or values. Research shows that blacks are systematically discriminated against in employment, get lower returns on their investment in education, value education more than whites do, and are actually more family-oriented than whites are in conventional terms. What we ought to be cognizant of is that being poor and being black looks much different than being poor and white, in large part due to the racial wealth gap. The prominent economist William Darity explains, when wealth is taken into account, virtually every group-based disparity in behavior customarily attributed to racial differences in cultural orientation disappears. Culture matters, just not as an explanation for racial disparities, right? And so then we try to bring in things from popular culture, like Twitter, right? To get a feel of how people are either engaging in the word that we're describing or engaging with the bigger concept. Another thing that we do is we actually examine words that are kind of in the popular culture ether, like black girl magic. Why does even a concept like black girl magic exist, right? What does it do? And we call this a tool of liberation, and also we categorize this as the wisdom of popular culture, right? Right, the recognition of the beauty, ability, resourcefulness, and perseverance of black women in a society marked by anti-black sexism. An effort to highlight the role of black women in all aspects of U.S. life. We give sometimes synonyms or antonyms, and then we also give a guide towards referencing other entries, right? And one thing that we do throughout the book is we put in bold, throughout the entire book, the words that we help define in chapter 2, right? So there's like this constant use of a reference. In chapter 3, we take a bit of a historical turn to make the case that racial progress is neither linear nor inevitable. We do this mainly by starting with the radical Reconstruction period following the Civil War, and then go into the Civil Rights Movement and onward. And this is just an outtake of one of the insets that we have. So we have lots of illustrations, we have cartoons, and we have insets like this that are talking about the numerous race-based acts of mass violence that were carried out by white militia and lay people against both blacks, indigenous peoples, Chinese, Mexican, other people of color, and their white allies. Right? And that's a part that often gets lost in these stories, right? Sometimes when we think historically, we think that white people are either absent of the story or they're only in opposition to people of color. But what we need to unearth are these histories of alliances, right, and collaboration. And that sometimes that also meant being targeted by white supremacist acts. So we start in 1863 and we end in 2017. In chapter 4, what we take on are this idea of colorblindness, right? The assertion that because race shouldn't matter, that it doesn't matter, right? And that this is an ideology. It's a way that we see the world. It's a way that we make sense of the world. And often it comes off as innocuous, it comes off as innocent, it comes off as even being helpful towards racial progress. And what we want to do here is put the pause button on and re-examine how we use these scripts, these things that we know to say, it just comes to us, we don't even think about it, it's very taken for granted. And so, you know, we talk about the kind of thing. It doesn't matter if you're blue, you know, black, green, whatever. People throw out polka dot when they're talking about people as though people are polka dotted. You know, I didn't vote for Trump, therefore that makes me whatever. Or I voted for Obama, that makes me such and such. We want to push back on these notions that these are not appropriate. We shouldn't really try to be defending ourselves from so much accusations of racism as we should try to be propagating acts of anti-racism. And that's the kind of turn that we're trying to make. We're trying to flip the script. We're pushing back on politics of respectability, which has been used for decades now by people who are marginalized because they see it as a tool of like progress, of getting into the mainstream. But what we problematize is that this ultimately hasn't worked for everybody. That whenever you're playing into the politics of respectability, there's always somebody still at the margins. We're trying to understand that people who are living in the margins of the margins need to be prioritized as well, because that's when we all become safer. That's when we all are living in a healthier society. In chapter 5, we take a look at federalism. And we start out by saying, wait, hold up, don't fall asleep yet, right? No, that federalism is not a really, you know, energetic topic for a lot of classrooms. But what we want to do is we want to turn it on its head. There's been such emphasis on how states' rights have been used to preserve inequality and to preserve hierarchy, but that, right, we need to also think about how federalism possibly empowers us to act locally, that local power is real power. And so we use this chapter to lay out all the reasons that this is possible, the ways that state budgets equal our values, and that we can be very active players, especially in the local. That we should think about the national, right? But strategies sometimes at the local are where we make the most gains. Okay. And then we end on chapter 6 with 21 affirmations for the 21st century. And I'll read this section as well. Let's see here. All right. We are leaderful. The contemporary movement for Black lives has been critiqued as leaderless and thus unorganized and unsustainable. These critics are missing the mark on more than one account. First, movements of the people are built on and sustained by collective activity. Movements are not like group projects at your school or job, where the work can still get done by one ardent member while others slack off. This movement will be sustainable so long as a critical mass of people come together in a variety of ways to publicly advocate for the value of Black life. Second, we've been hearing since at least 2003 and the protests against the US invasion of Iraq that movements were starting to look disorganized because seemingly disparate issues would take the stage together at a single event. That is, at an anti-war march, we might have seen environmental conservationists critique the United States' dependence on oil alongside socialists castigating Halliburton and other corporations for making money off non-competitive wartime contracts. What some people fail to understand is that social movements are rarely, if ever, focused on one single issue or goal. What may be different in contemporary social movements is the conscious strategy to publicly articulate the connections among racism, patriarchy, disregard for the planet, capitalism, and the industrial complexes of prison and war. The willingness to incorporate these strands into a narrative for social change is in no small part due to the growing resonance of the politics of intersectionality. These movements are not unorganized because there is more than one message. On the contrary, the multiplicity of messages is what is being organized. The politics of intersectionality does not compel one to discipline speech or behavior so that only one issue gets addressed at a time. One is instead disciplining oneself to be mindful of the matrix of domination and to keep that mentality when countering police brutality, gentrification, and budget cuts to subsidize school lunch programs. Lastly, there is no one way to lead. We must dispel this myth. Not every leader is an orator or a natural in front of the camera. Leaders are people who motivate, who organize, and who do grunt work, that collective activity, so that it has momentum. Leaders make contributions and share ideas. Dependence on the presence of charismatic figures subliminally suggests that there are few leaders among us, but this is not true. The misguided belief that leadership is scarce entrenches elite representatives who either are addicted to power and looking for any justification to continue to wield it, or would like to walk away from power but are afraid that their efforts and accomplishments will be squandered if no one steps up to shepherd them to the next level. We can teach children how to be leaders, and we can mentor adults to become more influential and cooperative. One of the most important things we can do as leaders to ensure the progression of this social movement is to train the next generation and follow confidently behind. So in this chapter, we have a number of things that we touch on. The idea that second-class citizenship is actually still very much alive and well, and not just in the ways that we've articulated so far, but even thinking about Washington, D.C., and the fact that right now, right, this area is campaigning for statehood, right? This jurisdiction needs to ask for approval from Congress to patch a budget, to do simple things. And it's not lost on us, the majority of people who've been living in Washington, D.C. have been Black. The arguments that have been made to not bring about statehood have been this idea of like very patronizing, I mean, very racialized and even gendered language, right? We talk about beware of woker than thou itis. Right? There's a way that even the woke folk, the people who feel like they're at the front of the movement, can actually be damaging it, or really failing to bring people into the fold because they're trying to outperform one another, because they're trying to shame people, right? And that's their objective. They're trying to get the likes on social media. We're asking to, cool it. Please examine yourself. Right? And try to do the best good where you can, right? You might actually learn something from talking to the person who you think is more ignorant than you are. Each chapter, to facilitate discussion, has a set of questions that are ready for debate, right? You can use this in a classroom. You can use this at your church congregation. You can use this at the mosque, right? You can use it in your book club, wherever, right? And we also add different resources that you can look at, books, films, sometimes children's books, podcasts, right? So you can take it upon yourself to learn more. This is just, a preview of what you can expect if you get our book and read it and use it. And so we would like to open it up to questions or comments at this time. And then again, remember that if there's something that you would like to say that's not on camera, we can take those questions and comments afterwards. Okay, great.
Speak into the microphone.
Thanks, Tehama. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you. Yeah.
So do you define woke in the book? And can you explain what you mean by staying woke?
We do. We have a thing early on, remember? It's so funny, right? We've written this so many times. Remember that?
Did we write that?
We did do that.
We explain it so many times.
It's an
we talk about it all the time.
Hold on. While I'm looking for it, if Candis wants to riff, here it is. Hold on.
Oh,
actually just found it. A note on the status of being woke, page 12. Just so we're all on the same page, we should mention that having knowledge about the facts of racism and the mechanisms that produce and reproduce racial inequality doesn't necessarily make someone woke. There are many people who know the facts and use them to insist on anti-Black narratives and pursue public policies that enhance inequity. Knowledge is a necessary but not sufficient component of being anti-racist. You have to put your knowledge to use in order to eradicate the problems of racial injustice. So
I was just going to say, the pause that we were like, did we write that down? Is because we always talk about this book as downloading our brains. We get these questions all the time, and so we were kind of like, can we just put them on paper? And then just when someone asks, we just be like, here, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, apparently we did answer that
We
question.
did that. We also, we're also in the book, we talk about, right, it's about gathering information. It's about, you know, being open to the idea that you have blind spots. And maybe there's a way that being white and being woke may have different meanings than being a person of color and being woke. And here's what I mean by that. Maybe it's possible that when you're a person of color and you're thinking about racism and anti-racism, that being woke sometimes means paying attention to your own intuitions about a situation. So I think there are ways that people of color often are in situations that don't feel quite right, but they're trying to give the benefit of the doubt to, right, that, oh, okay, maybe this person didn't mean this thing, right, like trying to rationalize the best possible intentions. But being woke probably also means being like, well, maybe there is a reason why your gut is speaking to you. Maybe you need to ask more questions about the situation. And in either case, whether you're white or a person of color, we are encouraging everybody to ask the question. If somebody's saying, oh, what you said is racist, maybe the helpful response is, well, can you tell me what was racist about that, right? And to try to get into that kind of habit rather than saying, no, it wasn't, right? I didn't mean that. But what do you think I mean by that? And that's a hard corner to turn, because being accused of racism is like a super stigmatizing experience, right? And so we're also trying to cultivate different attitudes and different ways that we relate to each other on this issue, right? That racism is a thing that we do, not so much as a thing that we are, possibly, right? That there's a doing, and we're not the only people who are trying to turn that message around. Thank you for the question.
I heard this term the other day about self-correcting.
Oh.
And I was wondering, how do you encourage people to self-correct their perspective on the discussion of racism?
That's an excellent question.
That's a good question. So
From a veteran educator.
The first thing that comes to my mind actually is, you know, one of the things that we write about is that there are a number of scripts that we go to so easily that we've just been taught them, or not even taught, we get them by osmosis. That there are certain things that we automatically say. And so, you know, it's often hard for us to see what's right in front of our faces, and that's our own behavior. And your question is about this. How do we change our own behavior? And so I actually don't have a good answer, except that our goal was to write this book in a way that people can see themselves, see the things that they say, see the things that their friends and their neighbors say in the text, and in order to interrogate it further, right? And so, you know, we've all heard people say, I voted for Obama. I would have voted for him 3 times if I could have. Mm-hmm. But why are you saying that? What does that mean? And here we try to really kind of outline, here's probably what your intent is. Here's how other people might hear that. And here's why your vote for Obama or Trump or not Trump is a really blunt proxy for your values. And so, you know, we try to help the process of self-correction mostly by mirroring the things that we see most in the way that people talk.
Yeah, I think also we have to change our culture a lot in so many ways, but I think one of the ways is that, like, if we are calling for social change, then we have to allow for people to change. And when you're constantly worried about being right, because to be wrong means that you will be forever felt like you were the wrong person, you were the racist, you were the sexist, we have to allow for people to evolve too, right? The other thing that I'm thinking about is, I just reviewed this book, another book, where the author said he's talking about on college campuses how there's all this attention to people being attentive to their privilege and calling out their own privilege, right? Calling out their own privilege. And he says, you know, this might be helpful for introducing certain concepts, but what it gets to us away from is the idea that it's not just individuals acting as individuals, it's us as the collective. And this is why we focus our book on structural racism, those disparities, right? It's not just, you know, whether a single person is using an epithet or using one of, you know, these colorblind scripts. It's about like what are we doing with our policies? Who are we getting into office? Who are we voting for in the mayor? Who's on our school board? And so we could be self-correcting politically, hopefully, as well. Yeah, thanks for that question.
I'm curious about how you tackle the American mythology in the book. It seems like it could be a force for good in uniting dissimilar people, but also used as a cudgel to keep us divided. So what's the role of like the intersection of wokeness and our national mythology?
That's a great question. Why does this thing keep bugging me? Okay. I was actually thinking about this when. Go ahead. What were you gonna say something?
No, you've been thinking about it.
We directly tackle the idea of American mythology. It's one of the categories that we treat in chapter 2. And so one of the things we talk about is meritocracy, which is a big one. The reason meritocracy feels like a really great idea is because it's supposed to be a counter to corruption and nepotism, right? It's the idea that individual people, on the basis of their hard work and their talents, can right, make a contribution, right? At the same time, it is also an excuse for reasons why we see inequalities the way they do. And so when meritocracy is used as a reason to explain racial disparities, that narrative sounds like, well, if black people would only work harder, if black people would get off welfare, if black people this and that, right, if they would stop having so many children, right, we know all these scripts, we've heard them a million times, right, that's somehow supposed to explain the decades upon decades of interconnected policies that have created a certain type of system and a likelihood that black people would be living in certain ways. Like, we need to dispel this myth. Right? And also dispel, and there's a flip side to this, right? That there are people who rise to high positions of power who are, as far as talent and hard work is concerned, are very mediocre. Right? Quite mediocre. And so it's also that interrogation too. So that's one way that we try to.
Well, I mean, and just bridging on the meritocracy thing is that, you know, we talk about using children as our barometer.
Yeah, right.
And children have no say in what schools they go to, what neighborhoods they live in. And so how do we use meritocracy as a measure for worth or value when we're talking about children? Right. And so even if we just kind of shift our lenses a little bit to thinking about, well, you know, meritocracy is supposed to be a measure of our values. Why do we value high SAT scores? Mm-hmm. Or who got to say that high SAT scores were the thing that we should value? Mm-hmm. Or that going to certain schools, you know, is a measure of merit. And so, you know, we just try to turn these things on their head, mostly to show that, again, these myths, meritocracy, the American dream, are often used to embed inequalities, to exacerbate inequalities, and to explain away the role of racism, right, mm-hmm. in racial disparities.
Right.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I was wondering if you all define justice in the book, and whether you do or not. It seems like justice is a part of the intervention that you're trying to make with this text. So if you could just say a little bit about that meaning, that would be great.
Do you want to take it?
So we don't define justice.
No.
But we talk a lot about equity. And equity is different from equality, right? That equality is everyone gets the same thing. Equity is people are given what they need in response to their needs. Mm-hmm. And so we focus a lot on that. That, we talk about, affirmative action, for example,
right,
as a mode of equity, because people will make an argument. Well, if you want to stop discriminating on race, then stop discriminating on the basis of race. But we also know that there are plenty of ways that people of color and Black people, especially, have been set back. And so maybe in that way, we are thinking about justice, yeah. but we've mostly thought about it in terms of equity. Thank you for that question.
It's a great question. And maybe it's because there's so many different even visions of what justice is, that I think that seemed almost like a little bit too much to even try to wrangle. But if we can talk about fulfilling basic human needs, which are not even happening right now, like that, we emphasize that quite a bit, as far as, that everyone should be at least a baseline. We haven't gotten there yet at all. So we talk about, we actually have a part about, I'm thinking about, and talking about reparations can be many things. That's a section in chapter 6. And we talk about microaggressions, which some people are like, there's a lot of feelings about microaggressions and the concept of microaggressions, which is the idea that when a person hears a slight, when a person from a marginalized group is hearing a slight from one person, and then later on in the day they hear another one, and then over a course of weeks they kind of mount up, and it starts to feel like a lot more than a backhanded compliment, right? It starts to feel like there's this pattern of discrimination, and that is a real thing, right? And where there's a debate on college campuses right now around freedom of speech and as far as this topic is concerned. But what we say is, well, maybe there's such a thing as like micro reparations, and maybe that's really relational. So one of the examples that we gave, you have to imagine, like, we're writing this book like over a course of a year and some, mm-hmm. and all these different things are coming up, and so we're thinking about Maxine Waters and saying, I'm going to mm-hmm. reclaim my time, right? Like maybe that's a micro reparation in the moment of saying, no, I'm going to change this relationship that's happening right now. I want this back, right? You took my time, I'm taking it back. Maybe that's a form of justice for her, right? It's a great question, though.
Hi, Candis. Hey, Tehama. Thank you so much for presenting the book. I had a question about solidarity. So I grew up. Tehama knows this about me. I grew up in South Texas. I'm Mexican American. Grew up in a kind of Roman Catholic Mexican American families, are very prototypical, and I was, in retrospect, I'm shocked at the kind of level of sort of vitriol sometimes that Mexican Americans heap on African Americans, right? And sort of kind of, and looking back at that background, really, really struck by how much of that happened in just normal conversation amongst Mexican Americans. But I'm thinking about the moment that we're in today, right? And how we sort of build bridges. And of course, for a lot of people, they're both, right? If you're Dominican, if you go anywhere in the Bronx or Washington Heights in New York City, right? And I'm wondering a little bit about how we build those links between different communities of color who oftentimes haven't always had an easy relationship, where although people on the political right see a whole army of people of color coming for them who are all in cahoots with each other, which I'm always like, I'm not sure you're seeing what actually happens, right? So I'm just wondering if y'all thought about that in the book and what your thoughts might be on it.
Question. Do you want to respond? Okay. Do you want me to?
You start.
Probably the place where we most do this, addressing the idea of solidarity, is in constantly referring back to intersectionality. and as a theory, as a way of thinking about the multiplicity of identity. And it's not just to say, and we point this out very clearly, it's not to say that, oh look, I'm a woman, I'm biracial, I'm a professor, I like high heels. Like, it's not that identity, right? It's like to talk about why various facets of our identities have like certain power components, right? Either on a high end or a low end. So when we're talking about, so if we have that concept there, intersectionality, and then we have another concept, which is advocated by political scientists, right? Kathy Cohen in particular, secondary marginalization, and thinking about how people in the margins of the margins are treated, right? So those people being, oftentimes, Black women as a whole group, undocumented Black people, formerly incarcerated Black people, gay, lesbian, bisexual Black people, transgender Black people, and thinking about, they have, right, there's these multiple identities. So solidarity, when I'm thinking about your question here, is those people don't exist in a vacuum either, right? Like there are alliances to be made between Black transgender people and white transgender people. And so that when we can, when we are best attending to the needs of these various groups, we are allowing for bridges to be built even right across racial lines, right, or across lines of gender, and across socioeconomic status. But then there's also like hopefully, in understanding why we wrote this, right? We don't have two Black women sitting up here as authors, right? Like, we are an interracial team, and we've had different ways of thinking as we've written this book, and we've had really very thoughtful, sometimes very difficult conversations in writing this book, trying to convince one another of a certain way of doing things or a certain assertion. And I mean, for me, and I can only speak personally right now, but like, solidarity is an absolute necessity in my life. My whole life requires that. And I think, and maybe some people who are, if they're biracial, or if they're in kind of like some kind of interracial or some kind of intercultural relationship with other people, friendships, whatever, where they have intimate bonds, solidarity must happen in some way. So, I mean, that certainly drove me into this project as well. What are you thinking about?
So there are some, I heard this quote that the most important things in a book are the things that didn't make it. So there's a lot of things that didn't make it. But one of the things that didn't make it, so we start off with this analogy about this burning building. You walk down the street, there's a burning building. What do? All of the buildings matter, but the building that's burning is the one that matters most. And so then we're like, okay, can we like keep on with this analogy throughout the book? And so then we're like, are some people like adding fuel to the fire? Are you just letting it burn? What are you doing? All this stuff. But in that conversation and thinking about your question is, if we did, let's say we did extend that analogy, that we tend to think about anti-Black racism as a thing that only white people do. And so, that there are all sorts of people across different groups that are also adding fuel to this particular fire. And that then the solidarity would be that we're all, trying to put it out, but also to not like play oppression Olympics, right? And I think that sometimes is one of the things that gets in our way of, yes, we all actually, Latinos, but even within that group, right? There are, Puerto Ricans who have citizenship, and fourth generation Mexican Americans, and then Cubans who all of these things, like even within a group, is to be attuned to the idea that if we don't put the fire out, that the whole neighborhood is gonna burn. And so that didn't make it in the book, but that's the point in the question of solidarity, that would be the answer, is to not say my building matters more, but instead to recognize that if we don't deal with the problem at hand, that we are all in danger. And so we should all take time to deal with the issue at hand.
Hi. Thank you all for this. I'm really excited about this book, excited to read it and use it. So I have a couple questions. Curious if it's in here, and if not, just your thoughts on it. So I've been in a lot of spaces recently, especially with very young folks. So I guess Generation Z and like very younger end millennials. And I feel like there's what I would call like the woke Olympics. I don't know if you've already talked about this, right? Where just folks are kind of fighting and arguing about how woke they are, how much they know. And, you know, this can happen among young people of color, but really can be, you know, anybody. And so I found that to be very frustrating and kind of exhausting. And as someone who's a political scientist myself and been studying this a long time, and folks that have studied this much longer than I have, right? It's just an interesting phenomenon and how that plays out in conversations and discussions and around current events, around organizing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And kind of related, what maybe could be like a symptom of woke Olympics is the term Latinx. So that's one that I personally don't like and don't use. I feel like it's definitely getting in posts. I hear kind of unexpected people using it, unexpected white people, because I think that's the politically correct term to use. So kind of throws me when you're in a serious meeting and someone says Latinx instead of Latino or Latina. And I won't get into all the reasons why Latinx is problematic for me, but I'd like to hear your thoughts and if you wrote about that.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
We totally agree. We talk about like this woker than thouism. And even, you know, two things. One is that we lay out these concepts in chapter 2, and we try to say, look, this is how we are thinking about it right now. And that we could be challenged on any of these, and so we're open to that. So we're trying to model that behavior of, turns out that there might be another way to think about these things. And even since, well, I mean, this book was officially published 2 days ago, but even since like we sent it off, I've been rethinking like Black girl magic. In that now I would say that this term itself is kind of being co-opted into like, well, Venus and Serena did it, like, you know, like almost died and now she's fine, like Black girl magic, you know, instead of thinking about the inequalities that happens at hospitals or Beyonce or what, you know. And so now it's like, see the sheer will and strength of Black women outpace like all of these inequalities. And so even like in that time, we've seen this word change. And so we hope to model the idea that words can change, but also that we can learn something new from each other. Mm-hmm. The second thing that comes to mind is, yeah, it is frustrating because what that does, what woker than thouism does, is instead of trying to, we don't give people room to learn. And so, you know, there are some people who are aggressively ignorant, but there are some people who want to know and just don't know. And so that woker than thou, woke Olympics, is kind of like you're either in our club and you can't be in our club. And so, yeah, I feel you.
That's not what builds a social movement, right?
Yeah.
It's not what builds change. So we do address this, and it's actually in here. On the Latinx part, so we had a conversation about this, like, because so we understood and we understand that there is a contention around this word, right? And what it means, why it even comes about, why it's being used. We use Latinx, Latino, Latina, and we have a very long note. One of the longest notes I've ever written in the back about why we do that, and to try to explain the different intentions and contentions about it. And so yes, we use it, and we also use other, but we don't use them in some kind of random way. We have a system for why we do that. Yeah, thank you. Microphone.
Thank you. Hi, Tehama.
Hi.
Hello. So my question is going to kind of piggyback off of his question in terms of communities of color who are different and supporting each other. And I think mine comes from a little bit of personal experience that I've lived in the DC area for over a decade now, and being politically active and going to marches and stuff, I feel like as a 100% indigenous woman, that I've tried to be the best like BLM ally as possible. And I found instances of maybe going to events and things and seeing like people in Redskins jerseys and feeling conflicted about that, and telling them in a very nice way, like, hey, you know, we're here for this. How do you feel about wearing that, especially in this area? And I don't know if there's like a better way to have that conversation, because it's always met very negatively, and my tone's never aggressive or anything, and I want to be the best ally. Is it better for me to sit back and not say anything, or do I approach the conversation?
I think you're doing a great thing. I mean, I think that you're doing, first of all, you're attending to the questions that are on your mind, and you're attending immediately to like your community. You're attending immediately to the ways that the indigenous people have been portrayed in like a crazy, stereotypical, and I mean, maybe we can make an argument that, you know, the Cleveland Indians logo is even crazier, but I don't even want to go down that rabbit hole, right? So the Redskins mascot logo, there's one of those perfect situations that it's so taken for granted that there are so many people who don't attach any type of particular meaning to it. It's the home team, right? And at the same time, it's got a rot history and a rot present, and it does send mixed signals about what a person is doing at a certain march. So like, I'm feeling like, yeah, you should be having those conversations, and I wish those people would be more open to like saying, oh, because it's embarrassing. Like, even if they agree with you, like they're probably like, well, what am I gonna do? Take this sweatshirt off? Am I turning inside out? Like, what do I do? But
I don't want to take people's space either. I'm like, this is your space. Like, I'm here to support you. So is it the right time, or is there a right time to have that conversation? Because then I feel like it gets felt as more accusatory versus education. Because I'm open. I've learned so much more about the Black community than I ever learned, and uncovered a lot of like oppression, Olympics, things I had inside of me that I didn't even know about.
I feel like we're all gonna have a challenge. Like, we're all gonna have that friend, maybe it was an old friend that we had that, you know, you've gone different ways and now you see them and they say or do something that's, you're kind of like, right? Like, I think sometimes we have to follow our best intuition about the context of the moment. Is this the right time? Is this person gonna come along with you if you talk to them, you know, 3 hours later when you know what I mean? Like, but I feel like, you know, if the space is about justice and the space is about the value of human life being treated because people along racial lines are not being treated right, then that's an even more appropriate space to do it. That's my take. What do you think?
I agree. Yeah, I mean, I think it can be awkward, and that's okay. And I think that some people will not see where you're coming from. That's typical. But I'm sure that you've said that to someone who didn't even know that's what they were doing.
Right.
And so in your coming and, you know, telling them that something that they didn't know, you help them. You know, so I hear you. Yeah, that's difficult, but I think you're doing the best that you can.
I mean, sometimes, like, right, things take years to settle
to click.
in, you know?
Yeah.
So, yeah. That's a great question, though. Thank you for asking that. It's like really concrete, and it's like something that we all deal with.
Thanks so much. So my question is completely different and maybe more practical. I wanted to ask you, practical, but I mean in terms of the use of the book. Classroom use of the book. And I'm curious about, you know, what kinds of classes this book will be used for, what you have in mind. If you can talk more about also what your hopes are for how this book might be used in those classrooms. I think that would be very helpful for us and also those watching, to understand a little bit better about how we might use these as in a university classroom, but maybe even beyond. Yeah.
I have we tend in poli-sci, we tend to have race day or, something like that, which I know it's done in good faith, I think, but the thing about American politics in particular is that everything about American politics, there's something about racial inequality that can be talked about, explained, so on and so forth. So, I would say that each of the chapters, the way that they're laid out, can be used across a semester in almost any class on policy, inequality, racial and ethnic politics, American politics, maybe if you get creative in a methods class, right? Like, how do we even, why do we dummy out black and white? Like, what does that mean methodologically to make the baseline group white, for example? So, like, we have this chapter on federalism. That is a whole section, right, on checks and balances. We have, we talk about, we tend to have a conversation about gradualism in politics. Reconstruction was not gradual, right? It grabbed the country, and I think it challenges students. One, we don't talk about Reconstruction enough. And two, that it does provide a counter example of what happens when there's a political will to change. So I would say, and our hope was to create a book that could be used, that's multiple chapters, could be used in all different kinds of classes. And the chapter, the 21 Affirmations, we did that also specifically in thinking about our students who get to the end of the semester on a class on inequalities, and they're like, now what, And so we really wanted to outline some things that our readers can think about doing in their own personal lives, be they students or, like you said, at your church, at your mosque, at your book club, that we can all do something. We can all use our talents, our skills, our resources, our time, little or big, towards producing a more equitable society.
We're at 1:30 now, and I want to thank the American Political Science Association for giving us this opportunity and this space and time to have this book lunch with people who are our friends, our family, our colleagues, and people who've been wanting to meet for a while. I want to thank everybody for coming here, for your questions.
Thank you.
And we have cake